thanks very much everyone for coming tonight. It's our honour today to be hosting Susan Davis, who's the CEO of BRAC USA.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Susan really briefly. So Susan actually founded BRAC USA. So BRAC was obviously already a thing in Bangladesh, and I think some other countries before the US got involved, but Susan decided to do that. Before that, Susan actually did come to Oxford, as I found out today. She was at St. Cat's doing an MA in International Relations. So I think probably everyone who here will know a bit about BRAC, but Susan's going to talk about it for maybe half an hour, and then she'll ask happy to answer any questions that you have. So just put your hand up or whatever, and we'll pick you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. And thank you all. I understand that it's the first day that you're back at term, so everybody's rudely adjusting to life in the cold back here after your wonderful holidays, I'm sure, right? I heard there was Monaco and Dubai and other warm weather, like Haiti. So I didn't quite expect to end up back here speaking at Oxford when I started out at Oxford a long time ago, before all of you were born. But it's great to be back. And if you can remember anything after our conversation tonight, I'd like you to remember 3 points. One, in the next 15 years, all of us together can actually eradicate extreme poverty. 15 years, by 2030, we can actually eradicate extreme poverty. Skepticism abounds, I know, we'll talk about it, but it's possible. 2, BRAC is a wildly imperfect and yet highly effective organization that's part of this global movement. And I encourage any of you, whether you're interested in just figuring out how to make money and start a radically different, successful business, or if you're interested in hybrid social enterprise, or if you really care just about helping the poor and being involved in charity work, take a look at BRAC, because it's unique. It is the GE of development, and it's an institution that's very hard to characterize. It doesn't quite fit. That's the second point. Third point, I'm going to keep it really simple. Third point is that everyone, I believe, has the capacity to be a change maker. It's your turn. I don't know if you've ever heard of Seth Godin. He's got an amazingly brilliant blog. And he's just written this new book called It's Your Turn. It's your turn, and it's always your turn. And what he's talking about is the moment in time now where you don't have to wait to graduate, you don't have to ask for permission, you don't have to get a credential degree or anything. You actually don't have to postpone whatever it is that you want to do. You've got the power, you've got the ability to claim it, you've got the ability to actually act on your dreams and passions and be part of creating every day the kind of world we want to live in. That's this radical field that I've been writing about and working in called social entrepreneurship. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit for you tonight, because there's nothing quite so powerful as discovering your own. And it took me way too long to do it, so I'll encourage you tonight. So 3 simple points. Now, anybody here know what today is, besides just the 19th? Any Americans in the room?
Martin Luther King Day?
Exactly, Martin Luther King Day. Anybody see the movie Selma? Yet, or read about it, or know the story? Martin Luther King, why do we have a day for him in America? Ooh. Anybody want to hazard a guess? Seriously, why would we have a special day for Martin Luther King?
He was a really important civil rights driver.
Is he an old guy?
Middle-aged when he did most of his stuff, I think. Oh, no, he's quite young. 20s?
He got going in his 20s, right? So, and when you watch this movie, so I don't assume you'll necessarily read the books or anything about it, but I know usually we get to the films, right? So you'll discover that he was incredibly young to all of a sudden be at the head of this movement, negotiating with the US president. Back then, who was the president? Anybody know? LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is known for getting the Voting Rights Act passed. So it's a fascinating story. The ability to actually push forward civil rights, to exercise our democratic franchise, came head to head with this preacher named Martin. And there was a lot of organizing. There was a student organizing group, there was his group, there were a bunch of them, and there were different tactics and strategies. And so part of this hypothesis with social entrepreneurship is I want you to develop the lens, develop the glasses, the ability to see and spot the jujitsu points of social change. No matter what your field is, they're there. So you can unpack the individual. You'll find these social entrepreneurs in every walk of life, in every field, all over the world. Usually they're creating some kind of organizational vehicle, an enterprise, a nonprofit, a university, or whatever, but some way to organize and express that energy. And then for the big changes to happen, connecting and fueling and building a social movement. The entrepreneur, the organization, the social movements. I think that's how shift happens. And since it's here, Martin Luther King Day, I want to just give just desserts to the importance that he played and the important role that a lot of people in the struggle for human rights, for civil rights, for our own ability to be in our privileged settings here today have played. And all the movements that are active on the front lines now, who are trying to still exercise full human rights on this planet. That's the undone agenda. So if you look at social entrepreneurship, I define it as the process by which individuals try to transform or create alternative institutions. Now, all of us don't end up being somebody that has a day named after them. In fact, most of us won't. Maybe there'll be a Susan Davis Day, but it'll probably be for one of the millions of other Susan Davises, since there is a Congresswoman, Susan Davis, and there's lots of Susan Davises. And you may not even realize that what you're doing will add up to anything and that anybody will ever remember what you do. But the reason that you do it is not for the fame or the fortune or all of that, right? The reason that people end up doing what they do is because they can't escape it. Something is pushing you to be able to do what you feel is right. Now that's the story that I want to share with you about this guy who was quite the charmer. He was actually in his 30s, so he was a little late, not like Martin coming to the party quite young. Name was Fazli Hassan Abed, and he was a ladies' man, a charmer, fancied himself a poet. He was hanging out, having the good life here in Britain. In fact, he had gone to Glasgow to study naval architecture until he realized that Bangladesh didn't have a navy, and maybe better get something practical, and so shifted to accounting and actually became a CPA. But really, he was having a good time living in Europe and traveling around, and wasn't interested to listen to what the family said. Oh, go home and get married. Everybody wanted to arrange a marriage. He wasn't having any of that. Finally gets back and has one of the fancy jobs out of the corporates, Shell Oil. And in fact, he ended up being, I think, one of the highest paid people working for this multinational in the 60s, when all of a sudden, life changed. There was this horrible cyclone. Horrible cyclone. And they estimate somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people were killed. Now, how many people have actually been to Bangladesh? A few of you, I'm sure. Just one? Really? So how many people have been to the Gulf of Mexico and Louisiana? Oh, look at that. Me and you, we got to talk. Come to dinner after. So it's very similar, right? We're talking below sea level. If for those of you who just saw the television story of Hurricane Katrina, you might remember those images. But whether it's a hurricane, American style, or a cyclone, Bangladesh style, we're talking about huge wind that whips up the water, and when you don't have any structures that are even two-story and you're below sea level, the tidal surge is amazing. So not exactly tsunami-like, but 14 to 16 feet tidal surges coming in and washing away lives, livelihoods, property, and that's what happened. And there was this island in the Bay of Bengal where they heard that there was just massive devastation. And Abid, this young man who was working at a privileged, perch in a multinational, joined this relief team, and he saw sights that he could never forget, that haunted him, and that actually helped him to change life course. To see the kind of desperate need, all the bodies, the inadequate response, all of that, this was 1969, pushed him when the war broke out between East and West Pakistan, to become part of his own country's birth, their liberation against the Urdu-speaking, what became Pakistan. So he actually got out of the country and fled back to England, where he helped to organize and work for the British to recognize the Bangladeshi government once they won. Another famous Bangladeshi, the founder of Grameen Bank, went to America and helped to organize there for the American government to do it. They were guys in their 30s. They hadn't intended to do any of this, but at that time when the war broke out and their country needed them, they stepped forward. Now, going back to the new country of Bangladesh after that terrible war in 1971, the country, it's got over 1 million people were killed, millions of women raped, nothing working. It's that kind of crisis where, you're called to a different path. Abid started a little relief project in his home village up in the northern part of the country. He sold his flat in London and used that money to start this relief project. Never intended to become the largest non-governmental organization in the world. Did not have a business plan. Did not have a 5-year strategy. Did not have any of the things that most management consultants today will tell you you're supposed to have. He formed with his friends a committee, which is why it was originally called the Bangladesh Rehabilitation Assistance Committee. A mouthful. In working, doing relief, he learned that these people weren't even literate. How could he try to respond to all their needs for health care and all their needs to earn a living when they had to do everything? So he tapped Oxfam for the first grant money and set about trying to deliver an adult education program, improved health care, a whole set of services. But it was basically learning by doing. After the end of the year, he returned the balance of funds with a report to Oxfam. They, of course, had never had anybody try to return money, and they said, do you think you could get going, keep going? And so, at that moment, he thought, fork in the road, do I? A lot of us might have said, I'm going back to my cushy life. He said, I'll do it. and changed the name to the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee and kept going and never looked back now of some 42 years. The amazing story of going from a little relief effort with a guy who, you know, was from a pretty well-off family, had a privileged education, had a lot of opportunity, had been exposed to the best of what multinational corporate life, you know, did and the way they invested in building large-scale organizations. He decided to apply it to the toughest problems that he'd ever encountered in the birth of a brand new nation. And that is why BRAC is unlike, I think, any other, what you call in the UK, charities, or any other international development organization. And it's why when I went as a young 30-year-old to Bangladesh to work with the Ford Foundation, I decided this is the real deal. Wildly imperfect, as I say, very messy, but authentic development that you want to get behind. I worked for the Ford Foundation and thought, at least I was smart enough to recognize great social entrepreneurs when I saw them and get behind their organizations and helping to scale them up. What BRAC has been able to do is, first of all, listen to the people that they're working with, the communities, and try to figure out how to be an enabler. And because the problems are so interconnected, right? The literacy issues connected to the health issues, connected to the ability to earn a living, connected to the social and cultural issues of women's place, connected to all of this, what I would call the swamp, you know, the reasons that people get stopped and pulled under. All of that they tried to unpack and analyze. In fact, there was a brilliant book called The Net that analyzed the reasons why people were poor. Because it's not just about material needs, right? It's a political economy, it's an understanding of powerlessness and agency. And let me tell you, people who live on less than $1 a day are not the only ones who get stuck, right? We all experience stuckness in our lives at some point. And that's why it's so important to actually experience our own sense of power, our own agency, because that is how we get unstuck and really have the kind of fabulous lives that we want to have and have a fantastic time, and the large life where you want to find meaning and purpose. So BRAC decided to become a listener and an enabler. And that most marginalized and vulnerable person, usually the poorest female in the household, the young girls and those women, that's where the exploitation was greatest. And that's where they started focusing their efforts. How to enable that woman and her family to become the change makers from within. And so the support structures that BRAC has developed around it grew out of an analysis that was a political analysis about how to help people change their own situation. It was based on Abed's own reading of Paulo Freire's work, if you've read his important work out of Brazil, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's a consciousness-raising book and strategy so that people understood their own place and discovered their own agency. And not as individuals often, but working together. So it's sort of classic organizing techniques of how can you have a group of you that together you can be both peer support and peer pressure. So look at BRAC and that BRAC story through the lens of, one, the social entrepreneur building an organization and trying to connect to social movements. Look at the power of organizing and of trying to help people awaken to their own sense of power. And look at the factors that enable that transformation to happen. So fast forward, BRAC in Bangladesh has over 120,000 employees. Today's 2015 budget is $832 million. 70% is self-generated from the profits earned on the interest payments and microfinance from those women who borrow at interest, a government-controlled interest rate cap, and repay those loans to produce their own livelihoods, and from the profits generated through about 16 social enterprises, what I call the Orang is like the Bloomingdale's or the Macy's of the Harrods of Bangladesh. It's a chain of a dozen retail stores where they sell decorative household gifts and accessories and clothing using women's traditional skills, the embroidery skills, to make beautiful clothing or pillow cushions and other things that mainly the middle and upper classes, the yuppies in Bangladesh, buy. Not on fair trade, do-gooder grounds, but on fashion, you know, to make its design-led and to compete and set a standard there. And other businesses, things in the heart of the economy, like the poultry industry or the seed industry and agriculture. So 16 different social enterprises, and the largest one is microfinance, generating not just profits, of course, to feed back into growing the organization, but as a strategy to create jobs and a strategy to create inputs for people to become more productive. So seeds that will germinate and produce higher yields, or chicks so that they can become a poultry business person, or access to the market so that they can actually get this beautiful embroidered stuff that they know how to do, that their grandmothers taught them how to do, sold and to a market where someone will want what they want. So the strategy that BRAC employed grew right out of people's needs, but it represents in one place this conglomerate where you can find almost every strategy that others are using, have used, have riffed off of. And at the base, you not only see the microfinance group members, but you'll also see a business model where those women, community women, get recruited and trained and empowered to be the last mile service delivery of better health, of poultry and livestock services and health for the animals, or agriculture promoters, even human rights and legal services. There's someone who will step forward and say, yes, I want to make a living and be trained to do land measurement services. And we're organizing that under our legal services program. Why? Because we found out 60% of all the cases, the human rights violations, all the violence that was going on, had some underlying property rights dispute. And so in trying to figure out what's a way that we can help solve that problem, we developed a cadre of human rights educators. So one woman will train other women, and they'll all pay her 15 taka each. So there's an incentive for that, to pass on knowledge on what the inherited rights are under the Muslim law or Hindu law. What are your abilities to get a divorce or to get custody of your children? What happens when you get raped or assaulted? What are your options and means? And this is where then you're looking at both empowering that woman as well as that community, so that when she's looking at and hearing the stories of her crying neighbor, she can figure out how to be the resourceful one and get her the referral to either the medical services or perhaps into a special program for destitute women, or access to some skills so she can begin to learn. So back to the agency, right, of the individuals who live in those communities and a structured way to organize their assistance. That basic building block of working with the people in every community and organizing it into a national scale system, that's the BRAC story. And someday, BRAC believes that, you know, Bangladesh will be an emerging market country, we'll take care of that poverty, at least the extreme poverty. There's probably always relative, you know, poverty there. But has been, besides having this large nonprofit organization, it's been investing in related industries, for-profit businesses. So if you look at the investments, you'll see that the NGO, BRAC, owns 44% of BRAC Bank. BRAC Bank is a publicly traded commercial bank. Started to 2001, and the IFC, I guess, owns 5% of it, International Finance Corporate. The rest is publicly traded, went public 3 years after funding. The largest small business lender in the country, and if you look at the subsidiaries underneath BRAC Bank, you'll actually see a mobile money company, a joint venture called Bcash. So now, I think it's this month or next going to pass M-Pesa as being the largest mobile money company in the world. Over 18 million customers. And so Bcash, money, it's now become a verb in the language. And it saves every rickshaw puller a lot of time and hassle to be able to get money back to his family way in the north, and is actually changing the way we think about a lot of our services. So there is a whole set of investments that the NGO has made, sometimes a small share in a company, sometimes a large share. Some are for-profit, some are not-for-profit. BRAC University is probably the other institution founded at the same time as BRAC Bank. And BRAC has a full-fledged institution, 6,000 students, undergrads and graduate schools. I was just telling Anna, you can go do your master's in public health there. There are kids from 22 countries that have come. I don't know how many from Oxford, but probably a few. In fact, we've had people do their gap year and stuff in our research units in Bangladesh as well as Africa. And part of the rationale of why would this social entrepreneur, why would Abid create not only a bank, but a university, along with it, the nonprofit? Because you need lots of different responses to social, economic, and sustainable development. You need a ladder of opportunity. It's not just the severe ultra-poor that need to be supported with the hand up. You need to actually have job creators. So small business finance is extremely important for the development of the country. So is corporate finance. Right now, corporate finance is needed so that those garment factories are able to improve, and that whole value chain can experience the kind of standards that brands in Europe and North America expect. So those jobs that are created through the formal sector, through large-scale factories or small businesses that employ 5, 10, 20, 50 people, they're extremely important in order to create wider opportunity for everybody, certainly for such a young population. And so if you look at the interconnectedness of the kinds of solutions that are needed, it's not an either-or. It's not micro business versus large scale. You actually need the entire ladder. And the linkages between the investment and the priorities that government tax credits or something would be used for, that's where there's a lot of debate. But if you look at the world from the perspective of the well-accessed, you flip that lens. And so even if you imagine the world where someday poverty's gone, what will have happened? Well, those women who scrimped and saved and repaid their loans for chickens or cows or goats, they'll all have those, what will happen? Their kids, their little Anna, will finally have gotten to go to university. And then what? She'll need a job, or she'll need to be able to create jobs, right? So it's the transformation through educational opportunity that's so important. And the kinds of graduates that BRAC University aspires to is to produce the ethical leaders with the moral courage to do the right thing, the social entrepreneurs who will create the institutions that will be needed every day, because as we solve one problem, new ones will crop up. And it's that kind of relevance that higher education has, even in our most developed countries, right? That's why Oxford is one of these enduring institutions. And so part of, if you look at the lens of social change through BRAC eyes, you will see the most fascinating little microcosm of the shift that's required, on our planet, where we're basically trying to change how we live, work, love, and share the planet. And almost everything requires, right, some kind of transformation, whether it's our food chain, and there are lots of social entrepreneurs working on trying to change what we eat, how we grow it, where it's packaged, the safety of that, right? Our own health and well-being consciousness, or anything. I mean, touch a part of life, even death, and you'll find the fingerprints of social entrepreneurs, the institutions, and their movements behind it. I tell you this long story about BRAC because for me, it was eye-opening. When I got the chance to go at the age of 30, right? I told you with all the hubris that goes along with an American getting to give away money, somebody else's money, in one of the poorest places in the world, I had my eyes radically opened to a different path. And what I saw was not an approach really to charity, but an approach to how to use capital in different ways, how to use energy in different ways. And so part of what I became really lucky to do was to be a connector between the richest people on the planet and some of the very poorest. 8 years ago, when Abed was coming through and asking some of his friends to consider starting a US and a UK affiliate, this was back in 2006, they had just started working in a few other countries. In Afghanistan, after the US bombed and the Taliban fell in 2002, Abed basically said, we should do something to help, and rang up the Minister of Rural Development in Afghanistan and said, do you want some help? And sent a team there to see if there was anything that they knew how to do that would be relevant. Same thing happened after the tsunami in Sri Lanka. Again, it felt like everyone in the world was trying to do something and felt a responsibility to help. Now, usually, Americans, British, we have no problem of going to other people's countries and saying we're here to help. It was unusual for Bangladeshis to be there, and the donor community were like, well, what are you doing here in Afghanistan or Sri Lanka? I mean, don't you still have problems at home? And they were like, yeah, but we thought maybe there was something that we could do to help. We may not know anything, and nothing we know from Bangladesh may work in Afghanistan. I mean, it's, very different topography and climate and environment, but we thought we should try to see. And one of their funders at Oxfam had been pushing BRAC to go and look at the countries in Africa, because back then no one was on track to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. And surprisingly enough, Bangladesh was. And he said, look, here's like $1 million. Why don't you just go and look around and see, is there anything you can do? So it was like R&D capital. So they really weren't sure, but they went to Tanzania and Uganda and started talking to people and looking, and thought, well, maybe we can, because all the questions that we ask seem to be answered in a very similar way. In fact, maybe poor people have a lot in common about their needs as well as their aspirations. So it was at that time in 2006 where they were just starting in Africa and had already put their toe in the water in Asia, where he called on friends from the past who knew and had worked in Bangladesh and the US and the UK, and said, we need your help. All these other international NGOs raise money in the northern countries, and maybe we should try too. So that was the step where we thought, all right, shall we give it a try? And I went and visited and looked at the work in Afghanistan and South Sudan and Uganda and Tanzania, and I thought, this is worth betting on. there's no guarantee that an experiment like this would actually work, because it was a very good, grounded national development institution, from Bangladesh. But wasn't it worth betting on? We have a lot of lip service about South-South exchange and, learning. But I knew I didn't know enough to figure out how to make development effective in a lot of these contexts. If I can't plug in my phone and, have the laptop working, I'm hopeless, right? And the ability to actually be effective, in places where things don't work, or don't work a lot, and to find ways to, this is where the frugal innovation movement came about. And so the hypothesis was, all right, it took BRAC, 40 years back then to become what it is. Is there any way that we can leapfrog and maybe in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years create a set of sustainable institutions in a handful of places? Can this be a challenge and an upstart to the way development has happened? Is there an alternative to projects that come and go but don't build anything to last? So that's the experiment. Outside of Bangladesh, there's 10 countries, $120 million budget with microfinance, livelihood support, health and education, a focus on empowering women and girls, basically giving them the enabling environment to take charge of their lives and in their communities. Same kind of approach, adapted with variations. There's been already 10 years since the tsunami, and I'm happy to say one of the first sustainable exits ever in the history of the field. From a relief project, we built a microfinance program, then company, and had a Sri Lankan equity investor come in, and now have sold the company to that Sri Lankan equity investor at a profit, modest profit. And it's the only case I can find where a relief effort actually produced something that is commercially viable, and there was an exit from the business community. And it challenges a lot of what we think development is about. So I'd love to hear your challenges. I'd love to hear your ideas and to know what's on your mind, questions about the field of international development, about BRAC, about how you can come and work with us, because I do recruit, and maybe that's the real reason I'm here. Because we need to have the kind of transnational civil society organizing to get behind the best ideas in development and to do it at scale and to build institutions that can last or transform in the ways that communities need over time. And for those of you who have any kind of inkling that you've got an entrepreneurial bone in your body and you want to look at intrapreneuring, this is an incredible perch where you don't have to do absolutely everything a startup has to do, but you have to do most things because it's the kind of institution that gives tremendous opportunity to very young people who have that kind of can-do attitude and spirit, but who basically want to be rule busters. This next 10 years, 15 years, this is the time where everything that BRAC has done and most other development organizations have done is being reinvented. Reinvented because of the power of technology and the new opportunities that we have, right? You know the technology, I'm sure you all have one in your pocket somewhere, and you've probably been checking it along the way. But that is going to be changing the landscape radically. The Internet of all things, in fact, will do that as well. And for the first time, I actually read a non-pessimistic scenario of what the future could be. I don't know if you've ever heard of or read the founder of Singularity U's book, Abundance, but it's a techno-optimistic vision of the future. I mean, mainly what you've got is a steady diet of you know, utopias, right? The very pessimistic version. But to the extent that we say, all right, we're going to figure out how to connect with capital, connect with technology, and connect with the social entrepreneurial DNA and build a different kind of planet, I'm convinced we can do it. Floor's open.
I'm really interested in your promise, as it were, that we can end poverty in 15 years. And I was wondering, what are the assumptions behind that, and how likely do you think it really is?
Well, we've already halved poverty ahead of schedule, right? A lot of it is because of the growth arguments. But if you look at the Millennium Development Goal, that was how ambitious we were, halving poverty at the 1990 rates. And if you look now in every region of the world, even where there's some severe pockets, you've got poverty rates falling. Now, some of the economists are debating whether we can actually get to zero, and whether we'll have chronic 3%, and we'll call that a day and say that's fine. Activist movements are saying, no, zero is the number, and it'll be zero based on a definition of how adequate purchasing power parity at 125 will be. As I was saying, poverty is not just material needs, it's this complicated web on it. And I actually believe that if you look at our experience in trying to tackle what we call extreme poverty and really ultra poverty, we've got proven programs that allow people, time-bound way, 2 years, to be targeted, to have either assets transferred to them or small loans at concessionary rates with wraparound social support. A community group that'll look out for them, healthcare needs met, and weekly coaching. And if you've ever tried to, lose weight or become fit or something, a trainer or a coach is often really helpful. Well, guess what? It helps those women too who are basically very depressed, never imagined a different kind of future was even possible. So it will take a while to get out of that kind of depression. And consumption stipends are part of that, usually 6 to 9 months, so that instead of selling that goat or cows or the chickens and all of that, they'll actually have enough to eat. And usually they don't feel that they deserve to eat that, right? So often in our program in Bangladesh, we've had to mix the lentils with the rice so that they're actually not selling it. So imagine, I don't know if you've ever seen what slow starvation looks like, what deeply malnourished people experience, but it's not that you're just, poor. It's you don't even think you deserve anything different. And so the mindsets have to change along with the opportunity spectrum. And that's why the ultra poor program, we target people who are living on 60 to 70 cents a day or less. It really is the people who were too poor to join the microfinance groups, or their neighbors didn't want them in, so they either self-selected out or they weren't invited in. In fact, I did a TEDx talk at the World Bank Group on reaching the excluded, where I talk about this program and compare it to, they're the ones that aren't invited to the party. So this is a way that we target the people who, whether you call it last mile, the excluded, but the hard to reach, hard to find, really poor that need this kind of special handout. And the rest of the strategy is really about stimulating growth and job creation. So financial services, financial inclusion is a really big part of the solution. And if you reach kids as early as possible, maybe you all benefit from this too, or maybe you're struggling with it, but if you learn how to save, how to spend wisely, and how to earn, you are equipped to, in fact, deal with life. And the sooner, the better. Otherwise, you get into a lot of trouble, right? So there's a big movement to try to have children and young people be part of this financial system. And hopefully not the financial system that has ripped us off, loaded us up with debt, and crashed the modern world as we know it back in, 2008, when Wall Street and all the other bandits had to start melting down. So it's trying to get control over money so that people understand the power of savings and asset building, as well as the way budgeting and spending works. So the assumption that we can actually eradicate poverty is based on a set of changes that we will make that creates a greater enabling environment for financial inclusion, for self-employment and job creation, and actually targets the people who are living in extreme poverty and gets them onto some kind of ladder of increasing economic prosperity. And that's also in a context of trying to build and support social protection systems. And fortunately, there's a growing movement where there are safety net programs. A lot of the ones in poor countries are paid for by the rich countries, and you know what's happening in Europe probably around any social protection system. So that fraying of the promise is one of the political tensions we'll face in the future. But it is possible to imagine a floor where we actually address the worst forms of absolute poverty. And that's my assumption. Relative poverty will be with us, but absolute poverty will be considered morally unacceptable if we're going to call ourselves human. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, so let's hear you all, and we'll get. Yes, please go ahead. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, in terms of governments, what would you, as head of BRAC, like to see from governments? What support could they?
Okay. So governments, what would I like to see?
I actually have 3 questions.
Well, I'm not going to be able to remember all of those. Okay, go ahead. Try one.
My first one was, as you were saying earlier, BRAC has done everything. They've done chicken nuggets to one of the best universities in the country. So my first question is, what's the next frontier? And then secondly, in The Economist, for example, they talked about how BRAC, not just BRAC, but other nonprofits in Bangladesh, they've been competing with the government for the same pool of international funding, and as a result, there's this kind of weird parallel government thing that's going on. And so I wanted to get your comments on that. And then thirdly, as somebody, personally, I'm interested in international development, and as somebody who's been educating in the Western institution, we've been exposed to, we've learned all the different ways that things have gone wrong. What is our place in international development?
Oh, good questions. And what's yours?
I was just looking at the different programs that you've implemented and the long-term ones, because it seems to be that the problem necessitates not just from a lack of money, but also a mindset of inequality, especially between men and women, and whether or not BRAC has seen a shift in that mentality with the work that they've been implementing, especially the long-term projects. I'm wondering what your comments
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, good. All right, and the backbenchers, you'll get your questions on, I hope. Huh? The further you are away from me, the more intimidating it is, I suppose. Okay, we'll come to you in a minute. Let me see if I can remember with these questions. So, government advocacy agenda is pretty wide, but the thing that we're targeting first and foremost is this campaign to target the ultra poor, to actually have governments look at the evidence, because it's a rare data set where BRAC started this program in 2002. It got tested by the World Bank's consultative group to assist the poor, CGAP, along with some foundations in every region of the world. And you've got randomized control trials and qualitative data. So you actually have longitudinal data that deserves to be looked at and considered by governments to see how would this graduation approach, and that's what targeting the ultra-poor graduation is what they're calling it, how would a graduation approach fit in a social protection system? And whether you're entering from that social protection door or a growth door around sustainable livelihoods, I think you both ways in, the political left or political right, you get to the graduation program. It's not a panacea, but it's actually a really important part of the response that government needs to have on how do I take care of my citizens. And so the government of Ethiopia, for example, used the lessons from one of the pilots to deal with their safety net program. They have 10% of the population of Ethiopia on the equivalent of the dole. And it's horrible. I interviewed young people who just hate it because it's make work. You know, they take a donkey and move stones from the river up the hill, and you know, it's just incredibly boring and certainly doesn't make their heart sing. So the opportunity to create a little business and learn how to do something that gets them to a place of, you know, pride and dignity and actually earning is a fantastic alternative. So that would be a really big one. And the second government advocacy agenda has to do with equality, which connects to all three of you, actually, the questions you were asking. Fundamentally, I think the unfinished agenda of this century is the inequality between males and females on the planet. It's not that all the isms aren't connected, because they are, but this one is so pervasive and so difficult to unravel that you need to have both the legal structure set up and the institutions to enforce the new bargain, the new ways that we will raise families, the ways that we will take care of our young people, our children, the ways we will take care of our older people. Because God forbid, you know, we're all, if we're lucky, going to get, you know, sick and old sometime. The alternative is not so great. But so the care economy intersecting with the informal economy, intersecting with good old-fashioned sexism and inequality is part of the government agenda. And I think a really important one for what girls in Bangladesh, for example, or in Uganda, or when we look at the advocacy agenda, it's really girls are declaring their right to be fully human, to not be married off as kids. You know, the Girls Not Brides campaign is a global campaign that we're a part of. And BRAC in Bangladesh hosted a big meetup where they were bringing a lot of attention to it. But it's not something that government usually can wave a magic wand and solve. But they did try. They looked at the data and said, oh, well, we've done better. The average age of marriage used to be for girls 14, and now we're up to 16. So we can solve child marriage with the stroke of the pen. Just lower the age to 16. Done. And that's what they did. And the hue and cry from the feminist organizers and grassroots groups, the civil society, was so loud and so strong that they had to walk back off that plank and say, all right, we're not going to change the legal age of marriage for young women from 18 to 16, and from, because, you know, for men, for boys, it's 21, so you always have that age gap there, and they thought they could just solve it. But that's part of the kinds of advocacy agenda with governments. You really need to look at what is de jure equality and de facto enforcement. So, you know, every factory with 50 employees is supposed to provide for childcare, have a creche. Again, enforcement of that makes it very difficult, but that's part of the change. In terms of this notion of parallel government and what the economists said, and all, you know, the government is so much larger than BRAC or GRIMI or these large institutions. It is true that they sound quite big when you look at budgets and employees, but the government is truly much larger. I mean, the government provides for the primary education of 19 million primary age school-going children, right? BRAC dealt only with the 4 million out-of-school children. But because it has built the largest secular education system in the world, it just sounds so big, but usually in comparison to charity groups, not to government. And one of the strategies that BRAC has taken is not to do what government can do. BRAC feels that it needs to work with and through and try to make the government effective. And when, remember the story of the origins, everybody was on their knees. It was a brand new country, and you needed to try to build the strength of the government. So right now at BRAC University, there have already been, I think, 75 graduates for a master's degree in governance and development. And BRAC, the NGO, pays for the best and the brightest of the civil service to come and get a graduate degree, instead of sending them to Harvard or Oxford or somewhere. So that's part of how it's trying to build a stronger civil service. We'll always, and try not to compete with what should be a publicly provided service. And so it's a complicated argument of what do you do when the government's simply not working. So look at a case like right now with Liberia and Sierra Leone. We did not go in and start trying to set up competitive healthcare clinics, but God knows the system was at such a low level in Liberia and Sierra Leone that everything was needed. But when the community health promoters were organized and trained, we needed to refer them to a functioning government health clinic. So if, for example, the bench was broken and there was no microscope to be able to do the basic tests of does this person have TB or not, what BRAC would do is get the money to repair the bench and to buy the microscope so that it could work again, etc. When the government cold chains broken down because the refrigerators are broken, we created a motorcycle-based refrigerator repair corps. So see what you can do to actually get public services to work. Don't compete. We're not setting up private schools that are competing with the government schools. It was temporary schools for out-of-school children. And that's the philosophy of trying to make the state actually a functioning state. And the places we work are all weak states, fragile states, highly corrupt, often new government places, so it's hard. And the last thing was the student, yes. Well, what do you want to know? What's your opportunity?
Well, is there an
Yes.
appropriate opportunity?
This is what I was saying when we started. I mean, yes. I mean, we need to know what's going to really make your own heart sing. But for you to find your place in this big field, maybe for you to start something, for you to be the entrepreneur, or it may be for you to be the intrapreneur inside an organization that desperately needs you, needs your talent, needs your ideas. I decided I didn't need to create a new organization. I mean, although BRAC USA is a new affiliate, but instead of creating the Stop Poverty Now Foundation in New York, I decided to start BRAC USA because this organization has tremendous assets and power and a track record, and it's also got amazing risks and dangers and weaknesses. And so I decided part of what I wanted to do is throw my energy and weight behind an organization that was going from good to great. know, helping it to become world-class global. Because part of what I think Americans need to learn how to do is follow the leadership of indigenous leaders from the global south, instead of us thinking that we know best, because we're really good at that, you know. So the ability to combine can-do entrepreneurship with humility, that's a different twist. And so now I think it's a blast to get Bill Gates and George Soros and Pierre Omidyar and Jeff Skoll and you know, the MasterCard Foundation and the Ford Foundation, to get all of the money out of these rich individuals and foundations, and to get it into building institutions in places that, you know, maybe have a hope and a prayer of doing something really great. In the back, we got a couple, 3, good, come on.
I was wondering how, in India we have in some parts, a difference in power relations between men and women, and you spoke about how BRAC tries to work with the most vulnerable women and tries to empower them and thereby empower the family. But how does when BRAC empowers a woman with microfinance, how does BRAC make sure that she retains the autonomy to act with that money in the way she wants and to empower her family, rather than, you know, if the power relation were to affect her?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Do you want to build on that? Go ahead.
My question is pretty much very similar to his when you spoke about mindset changes as well. Where it's coming from, I believe, is in parts of India is where you find people with the mindset that the woman shouldn't work outside, she should be the bread, you know, she should cook and she should stay at home. So how do you, I mean, in trying to achieve that change and trying to make women more empowered, you kind of need a mindset change of the population to be able to, for them to attain that education that they want, because obviously they're not exposed to wanting education for themselves or wanting any kind of empowerment for themselves. So how exactly do you get that mindset change into place? And I was also kind of interested to know what exactly does the BRAC US and affiliates, how are they connected into the web of BRAC as a
The family, yeah, okay. So your 2 questions really pick up on this woman's question earlier about gender relations and inequality, and I probably didn't answer it as much. I mean, from the time when I lived there 4.5 years in the 80s in Bangladesh to now, there's been massive changes. And the place of women in society doesn't change automatically. Usually it's, what I've observed is, it's harder to change relations between husband and wife and easier between father and daughter, but still that's harder, you know, to do across the board everywhere. But so it's gradual. If you look at the research though, and the incredible work that our gender justice diversity team has been able to do, you'll see it's not just programs, but it's the power of television coming in. I mean, in the Martin Luther King story, it was television that was the most radical technology that filmed the violence in Selma, that caused 72 million to see it and put the pressure on the political system to change. It is the images of different male and female roles that have come into communities that have created different conversations. And the aspiration for education is strongly articulated by young girls. And frankly, it's probably how you change your own life. And decide that, you know, maybe you throw off your father wants you to be a doctor or to be the, you know, breadwinner, and you're going to go out and do something different. The ability to speak up for yourself and to find voice is a process of growing up and of a lot of tension and change. But when you see the role models of happy alternatives, that's also helped to create the shift. And you see in the traditional Bangladeshi culture, women would eat least and last, right? Husbands and wives rarely sat together and eat. Imagine what happened when a happy husband and a happy wife actually started sitting and eating together. I mean, we have a video of a couple who's, it's so cute. I love that story because I just imagine they made fun of the guy. They, called him terms the equivalent of like henpecked or something because he was getting involved in this. But ultimately, it was because they were having a better time. They were a happier couple and family that others wanted to get in on that. And that's part of where marriage has changed, where young people have said, I'm going to follow, love marriage, and that's been a big deal. So the changing norms around sexuality, around marriage, around institutions that are so ingrained in part of culture are also changeable. I was just telling Anna, I got married for the first time a couple of years ago because marriage equality passed in New York. And it was like shocking as I was sitting in a BRAC board meeting and they just told us about how the hijras are recognized as a third gender on the passport. And Pakistan and India had already done that. And there was a pride parade. So can you tell me that these societies are not capable of changing? It may not feel that way when it's your family oppressing you or your community and you're out here, but the truth is we're all part of that. Whether for me, the bayous of Bangladesh, I mean, it felt like those little villages in Louisiana. So part of it is person by person, but it's also tipping points. And usually, you don't have to change every mind. You need a critical mass. And that's where sometimes, if you look at X and O theory, it's often just 5 or 10%. But it's where one of the secrets of development has come about. Positive deviance is really worth studying. 99% of people may be doing it this way, but how did that 1% change? Study that and build on that. We're getting to the end of our time. There were a few more questions or comments or challenges. Please go ahead. I'll take anybody else who wants to come in. Please. Yes?
So you were talking about Albert and how he also found money before he started BRAC.
Yep.
And then how he started BRAC USA. But for us as graduates, we don't actually have influence or power. So to actually go out into the world and enter this industry of international development is actually quite difficult because we require experience and knowledge, which we don't really, I don't think we have at the moment. But like, how did you convince someone to help you start up BRAC USA, and how did Albert convince Oxfam to give him the money to start BRAC in the first place? Because that takes convincing.
The ingenuity of persuasion, right? But the first thing was he used his own resources. And that's what I did too. I worked for a year as a volunteer to raise the capital and put together the business plan to start BRAC USA. So I did other things to support myself, and that's a classic pattern. And people look for that term skin in the game. They look to see, have you invested? So when you are creating something, it is an act where you've got to believe in yourself enough to also figure out how to persuade and convince others. And whether it's a for-profit business, where you usually finance it yourself with family and friends, and then angels, and you move out, it's that same kind of thing. So when you have no money, what do you have? You have energy. To what is worth devoting your life's energy? When you answer that question, and you may change your answer over time, but when you answer that, it's very clarifying, because your power is worth a lot. And part of what I discovered is there's no career ladder. That's just a big myth. You don't have to climb anything to get anywhere. You are here. This is it. And so the decision of what do you need, if you keep your needs relatively modest, you don't then need a lot, and then you get to choose. And you may have to have a portfolio approach where you do some things just for the money that subsidizes your other things, which you haven't figured out how to make money from. But all of that is possible. And besides the, the ingenious strategies that people are coming up with every day, I mean, just if you're looking at what young people are doing, they're figuring out answers to those questions. But as I was saying, people are also in need of talent. So figuring out how to make yourself just indispensable is the best career advice I could give you. People are in need of finding driven, committed, reliable talent. It may be raw, but it's there. Anything else burning? Burning? Okay.
You were talking previously about the opportunities in international development, and I was wondering if there is any room, in your opinion, for people coming from the humanities, or is it only open to economists, business entrepreneurs?
Oh, no, wasn't I just recruiting the English major and Anna here? Yes.
Down to earth.
No, the truth is, I believe there's room for anybody who wants to be a part of it. It's a question of how and what skills are. I mean, if you're coming from a relatively privileged country and place, one of the things that we're really good at then being able to do is connect resources. So being able to write reports and proposals and be an interlocutor between, it's great. You may not be the best then, microfinance credit officer, because you won't be able to relate or even understand people in community X, Y, or Z. But so you have to find your place. But what I'm arguing is that we all have a place in this global movement. I used to worry a lot about, well, where do I fit in, right? Where is home? And the ability to claim your right as a global citizen and just say, I am part of this planet, and I'm going to use my energy in ways that, or at least part of the shift I want to see happen in the world, is you don't have to ask anybody for permission. You have to maybe figure out how you can buy your food and pay your rent, but that's a different question. It's not so linear as what you all might think. It really isn't. I mean, I didn't get that chance to go to Bangladesh until I was 30, right? So in saying yes to different opportunities, in just deciding that you can get on a plane and go and listen and learn, it's not about you saying, I've got the answers. It's about you saying, I've got questions, and I'm going to try to figure out where I belong. That's possible. And I'm sure if we had more people in the humanities, maybe we would be able to explain things better.
Susan, can I just ask, this girl's been asking a question like 3 times.
Which guy?
I'm pointing at you. Yeah, you just raised your hand quite a few times. I just thought you might
Yeah, but
know.
it's not a burning question, so if it
Okay, fair enough. Anyone got any more burning questions? Cool. Okay. Well, can we give another round of applause for Susan?
Thank you all. My email is susan@bracusa.org. If I can be helpful to you in your search along the way, reach out. If I don't reply, email me again. Thank you.